Bulldogs, they're coming off an SEC championship. They made a college football playoff. And obviously, with Carson Beck screwing up his elbow, Gunnar Stockton was in the game. And, he made the most of the moment that he's in. He's going to be starting for next year, too. And now that we're moving forward into 2025, I think there's definitely been some differing opinions in terms of how Georgia's going to look this year because, people like me always say to myself, I don't care how Georgia's roster looks, they're always going to figure it out. And then there's the other half of the country that thinks that Georgia maybe takes a little bit of a step back. I mean, they have to play Alabama this year, who they seemingly can never beat. They have to face Ole Miss this year, so hopefully maybe they can come back and win that game. And then you also have Florida and Texas towards the end of the season too. So it's definitely going to be some tough sledding in different parts of the year. But Matt, what are your general thoughts on this Georgia team? And obviously they're one of the best recruiting teams in the entire country too. So I mean that speaks for itself. But what are your general thoughts on Georgia right now?
I can definitely see where you would be, a little worried about in Alabama. They're still kind of hanging out there around the top. They haven't really kind of faded back too much, like I think we all kind of thought they would when Nick Saban left. We kind of made. I know I thought maybe I was like, are they going to do like a New England Patriots kind of thing where you know head coach leaves and you just kind of don't see them anymore. But they've still been hanging around. They still they've been able to kind of get good talent to come in and kind of continue the good run of success that they have. I know that it's going to be tough for them on the defensive side, losing your two safeties to the NFL. But look, they've still got some good starting players coming in. They've got some they hit the transfer portal. Starting quarterback Julian Humphrey, transferred to Texas A&M. They've got a couple other guys that have moved on as well, but they brought in four starters. So I'm curious to see just how they play. I don't necessarily know that I'd be worried about Florida. Um, Again, until they show me something, and I say that as a Florida State fan, until they show me something, I don't necessarily trust what they're going to look like. I would be also afraid of Texas. They seemingly somehow have showed up for several years in a row now and just continue to play the lights out football. I'll be interested to see how they play this year as well. Um, but yeah, I'm curious to see. I could just as easily see them go 8-4. I could also see them go 12-1. It'll be an interesting season for sure to watch.
Yeah, because when I think about Georgia, I go back and think about obviously the Georgia Tech game, which is probably one of the greatest games I've ever seen in my life. I think of the Ole Miss game, and I also think of that Kentucky game that for whatever reason they just really struggled with moving the ball offensively too. And we can point the finger at a couple different things in terms of, oh well, their offensive line wasn't healthy, or oh the receivers weren't getting open, or oh Carson Beck's overrated, or oh their running attack wasn't what you thought it was going to be. But ultimately, I mean, you brought up the fact that Georgia had the ability to be that sort of dynasty in terms of college football. I mean, the good news is they have the foundation to do that, right? I mean, you know, Kirby Smart, I mean, the guy is, he knows what he's doing. He's a proven winner. He recruit one of the best recruiters in the entire country. There's a reason why they're in the top 3 in recruiting every single year. But at the same time, I think most of the question marks are really on the offensive side of the ball, right? Because I mean, they bring in Zachariah Branch from USC, who I think is a dog and somebody who's going to be a legit difference maker for Gunnar Stockton, as he's kind of really learning how to be a starter in the SEC. And also, there's going to be just a lot more attention on him too. When you're filling in a guy for Carson Beck, there's going to be a lot of expectations there. But based on what I saw in the game versus Texas, though, I can see why people believe in him, because there's definitely something there with him. It's just a matter of, what those expectations need to be. Because even if you go back and think about the Georgia quarterbacks in the past, I mean, I think of Jacob Eden and Aaron Murray and all those dudes, and obviously Matt Stafford too. But I mean, ultimately, a lot of those dudes are kind of game managers. And I'm not even saying that as an insult. I'm just saying in terms of, hey, they don't turn the ball over. They have a decent enough arm. They find the receivers when they have to, and they maximize what they have, and they, delinquish, or they reduce their weaknesses as much as they can too. And that's just something that you just, as you're more and more scrutinized, that's just something that you have to do in order to be a national champion.
I mean, you think about how many national championships Alabama won just by doing that. If you're good everywhere else, you can stick whoever you want to back there in the quarterback spot. And as long as you're just not turning the ball over, they'll win a national championship. I mean, go look at all the guys that Alabama had back there at quarterback. I don't think any of them were starting in the NFL, but they won a national title and they got drafted. So you don't have to be great, like you said. Just be a game manager. If Georgia can turn around and be decent at quarterback, but you're stacked at maybe the offensive line. You got a good run game. You got an above average wide receiving core. When you're playing really well defense, it doesn't really matter. It could be you or me back there probably.
Yeah, because the thing is too, like, Georgia's one of those teams where you look at their schedule and you know that they're going to be favored in almost every single game too. And it's going to be fascinating to see whether the SEC decides to become a 9 conference, nine games in their conference. That's definitely going to be fascinating to see, because I think if that does happen, there's going to be a trickle effect in terms of some other conferences too. But, when you look at the schedule, I briefly mentioned it before, but, obviously beginning of the year, they have a couple tune-up games. You go to, or you're home versus Marshall. They lost the majority of their team. You have Austin P. That's an FCS, laugher game, where more or less a tune-up game. You're visiting Tennessee, which always can be a tricky game, but again, that's going to be such a wild card given the whole Joey Aguilar situation. But don't ever doubt Josh Harple, because he's definitely building something special there. It's just a matter of whether that's happening this season or if he needs a couple more. But I don't know if you have the schedule pulled up in front of you, but I mean, are there any other games that you see that you think could be kind of tricky? Because I know I have November 15th for sure when they play Texas definitely circled on my calendar.
I do not have the schedule up. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick here. And while I'm doing that, I think that, and looking at there's the schedule. But look, I was just looking at the depth chart for the wide receiving core for Georgia.
Yeah.
And outside of Zachariah Branch, who's a junior, the other 2 spots you got are senior spots. I was like, they should be very prepared and very well suited to step up for, Stockton, the same way that, guys kind of stepped up for, Carson Beck when he was here. Is Branch going to be the next, Lad McConkey? Probably not, but we don't know. Also he's not going to have a guy like a Brock Bowers, who also just was incredible. But again, like we talked about, I don't need you. If I'm Georgia, I don't need you to be those guys. I just need you to catch the ball in crucial spots when I throw it to you. As long as you're not going through and making crucial turnovers in crucial spots, I think you'll be all right.
Yeah, because I mean, at least defensively speaking, like, Georgia's one of those teams, like, I'm just not going to sit there and scrutinize too much defensively. I'd say the one criticism I would maybe say here and there, sometimes when they're particularly in the rushing attack, sometimes they're have some weak tackling here and there in terms of the linebacking core. But again, that's me being very, very overly picky, because I mean, they have one of the best staffs in all of college football. They recruit phenomenally. And I think they've really done a good job at really prioritizing the secondary this time around in terms of the 2025 cycle too. And I think we're going to see definitely a more aggressive side of them defensively too, especially with some of those question marks on the offensive side of the ball. And obviously replacing 13 NFL draft picks too is always a challenge, no matter how great of a coach or program that you've built.
So as I sit here and look at this Georgia football schedule,
Yeah,
like you said, you got back-to-back cupcakes. Even if they struggle a little bit at Tennessee, I see them pulling that game off. So I mean, realistically, you're probably looking at 3-0. But then, what a gauntlet you have! You got to go and play Alabama, coming off Tennessee. So even if you somehow sleepwalk through that game and it's a struggle, or whatever, you got to turn right back around. You know, you play Alabama, then you got Kentucky the week after that, and you just talked about how tough it was for them to win. That game in a game, but honestly, which Kentucky should have won. And that probably, if Kentucky ends up winning that game, that gets them into the playoff, which would have been, throw a whole nother wrench in there. They got to play
exactly.
all. They got to turn around and play Auburn after that. Um, you know, if that Ole Miss game on October 18th would have worried me a little bit, but again, Ole Miss, had to say goodbye to Jackson Dart, who went off to the NFL, and so I'll be curious to see how that game gets played. Um, the only other one, like I said earlier, the only other one that worries me would probably be November 15th. It's a late season game against Texas. If you're, if let's say Georgia's, 9-1 at that point or 8-1, wherever they are, that's a game I think that comes down to that you're going to need to win if you want a high seed in the college football playoff. Because the two games you got after that are Charlotte and Georgia Tech, which again you should win.
Yeah, and I definitely want to go back to this Alabama game for a second because there's two fascinating facts about this matchup that I think are worth pointing out. Number one, in their last 10 meetings against Alabama, Georgia is 1-9, and obviously we go back to last year where they lost 41-34 when they were in Tuscaloosa. But the other, I think, fascinating fact that I did not know until I looked this up, but this is the first time that Georgia is going to be hosting Alabama since 2003. So the fact that 20 years from now they're finally getting a home matchup, and the fact that that's kind of been Kirby Smart's kryptonite. I mean, obviously Ryan Day's equivalent is Michigan, Kirby Smart's equivalent is Alabama, and I think that's going to be the real game where I sit there and say to myself, okay, does Georgia really have all the pieces necessary to be the SEC contender again, or are we going to have the same Texas Alabama conversation that we sort of have every year? So for me, that's why I was really kind of honing in on that game, even though yes, it's early in the year and probably in November people aren't going to be talking about it as much because obviously hindsight's always 2020 and the later games tend to kind of be more important. But in terms of what Georgia's doing and where they want to be, I just think that game is just going to be so fascinating to watch, especially just how great of a game it was last year too.
Yeah, like I said, I think it sets the stage for the next couple games after that. If you come into that game 3-0, you know what are we looking at there? Or how strong out of the gate are you going to come? If you end up winning that game, you know how does that Kentucky game then look the next week? Are you going to be up and prepared, or are you going to come in off of a high, and get socked in the mouth, and then you end up, 4-1 leaving that game? But it could also be the same way if you lose a last second field goal to Alabama. I'm worried if I'm Kentucky because then you're coming in. I'm not losing two games in a row if I'm Georgia. You're going to come in, ready, looking for a fight. I think it could go either one of those ways because we've seen that so many times, not just with Georgia, but with several other teams where you win such a big game and the adrenaline's pumping and you kind of forget, oh crap, I got to get back and I got to focus and I got to, continue on. And I think Nick Saban did such a good job when he was at Alabama and he had Alabama at such a high point of getting that team to focus every week. And I think if you're Kirby Smart, that's kind of one of those things you really need to hone in on. And I think you need to focus more on, look, this is a business trip every week. We got a business to take care of every week.
Yeah, exactly. Because I go back to last year and I think of, we were talking about Kentucky a couple seconds ago when Kentucky beat Ole Miss and essentially eliminated any chance that Ole Miss had an SEC championship or college football playoff appearance. And then I go back and think about when Vanderbilt beat Alabama, who was number one in the country too. And yeah, it definitely is one of those things where I think we're seeing that more and more often where because it's such a resume based sort of playoff structure now, a lot of these bigger programs sometimes let their foot off the gas a little bit too much. And then you say to yourself, man, that you have 3 or 4 really strong wins, but then you have that one really ugly loss. And you sit there and say to yourself, well, how harshly should I judge that based on their overall team, based on the overall team and their conference play and the networks and all these different factors that kind of ultimately put everything together.
I think, and I'll say this, I I loathe the Gators. But Steve Spurrier had one of the best lines of all time. He was like, he used to run games up, and well, why do you? If you don't like it, stop me, do something.
Exactly.
And I think that more coaches probably need to have that kind of mindset. Look, you're up 21 to 10 early in the second quarter, make it 28 to 10. The further I think you get away from, maybe a 2.5 to a 3-score game, put that nail in the coffin. Put your foot down on the gas pedal, make it 3 or 4 scores. You want to put it out to such a margin to where there's no possible chance. If it's a lot easier to come back in a game if you're 24 to 10 than it is if you're winning 42 to 14. I don't care if you have 2.5 to 3 quarters. It doesn't matter. It's just one of those things where I think you have to kind of, like you said, make sure that we're keeping our foot down on the gas pedal every week.